Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about the top cancer-fighting foods, the best foods to starve a cancer. But in order to make any sense out of what those foods are, we first need to understand what does a cancer like. If we're going to starve a cancer, what is it that feeds a cancer? So the causes for cancer is glucose. There's something called the Warburg effect we're going to talk about in detail in a little bit. There's chronic inflammation. There is carcinogenic compounds. So there are different chemicals that can cause mutations in cell and drive the conversion from a healthy cell to a cancer cell. Also, a lot of oxidative stress can create an environment where cancers thrive. When we have a weak immune system, then we can't fight off the cancer. So the normal situation is that we have a certain number of cells go bad on a regular basis, but with a normal immune system, we can clean that up. So if your immune system isn't working, then that might give the cancer the upper hand. There are also some hormonal imbalances that can drive a cancer. And then there is gut health, because a dysbiotic gut, if you have imbalance in your bacterial flora, that can affect virtually every one of these other factors. So I gave each one of these items a little icon just so we can illustrate a couple of things along the way. But the number one thing we have to understand about these things is when we talk about cancer-fighting foods or the best foods for this or that, most people start thinking with a pill mentality. They think they're going to find that superfood that's going to go in and strike out all the evil and all the bad in the body. But it doesn't work like that, because first we have to realize that there are certain things causing the cancer. And unless we stop putting those factors in, there's nothing else we can do to make it better. So the first thing we have to do is to avoid all of the different factors that give the cancer the upper hand. And then we want to go in and figure out what are some really good foods, what are some categories, some types of food that can help the body, that can strengthen the body, that can strengthen the immune system, etc., and that might be able to offset or compensate for some of these factors. So the Warburg effect is basically observing that cancer cells prefer glucose. They're different than your normal cells. They come from your body's own cells, but they have changed. And in that changing, now they behave differently and they prefer different fuels. So there's basically two ways that a cell can make energy, whether it's a normal body cell or whether it's a cancer cell. And the first way is called glycolysis, and the other way is called OXPHOS, or oxidative phosphorylation. That's where we make ATP from ADP. And with glycolysis, that can happen when there is no oxygen present. It doesn't need oxygen to perform that reaction. Whereas OXPHOS, oxidative, implies that it can only happen with oxygen. And then we have two types of fuel, and one is glucose. And glucose can go into either of these two pathways. But if we use some other substrate, primarily fat, that can only enter into the OXPHOS pathway. You can only burn fat in the presence of oxygen, but glucose you can use either way. So a normal body cell, a healthy body cell that is acting well behaved, it is going to use primarily the OXPHOS because we typically have oxygen present. And then when we don't, then that normal body cell can also rely on glycolysis, but it's not going to be as much because, like I said, oxygen is the normal situation. But a cancer cell is not well behaved, and therefore a cancer cell is going to rely primarily on glycolysis. It's going to be its favored way of making energy, its favorite pathway. And even if it can actually perform oxidative phosphorylation, it can use oxygen, it's not going to be its favorite. It's going to favor the glycolysis. The normal cell is going to favor oxidative phosphorylation. And here's why this becomes super, super important once we understand a little bit. And you don't have to remember all the details. Just know this, that oxidative phosphorylation with oxygen, it's more efficient. We can get more energy made. But with glycolysis, we can do it faster. And that's what the cancer cell really loves, because the cancer is not well behaved. It's gone rogue. It tries to grow as fast as possible, and that's why it prefers the glycolysis. And now if we load up the system with glucose and we have really high blood sugar all the time, now we're feeding the cancer cells, we're giving them their favorite fuel, which allows very rapid growth. But what that also means is that the worse the cancer is, the more aggressive, the more malignant, the more fast-growing that cancer is, the more sugar-loving it is, the more it's going to depend on that sugar. And that's how they diagnose these things with imaging. They feed them sugar and they see where they light up on the screen, because the most aggressive cells are going to be absorbing the most glucose and grow the fastest. And if we understand that Warburg effect, now it becomes rather obvious what kind of foods to eat if we want to starve a cancer. So that's obviously low carb, or for some people even a ketogenic diet. And I made lots of videos on that, but I'll run through a few examples real quick here. So avocado, for example, leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, extra virgin olive oil, butter, coconut oil. These are all healthy fats that don't raise blood sugar at all. Other low-carb foods are things like meat, fish, and chicken, and we should always try to get those from natural sources. So grass-fed meat, wild-caught fish, and pastured chicken, if we can get it. It's always going to be better. Then nuts and seeds are low-carb, high-fiber. They don't raise blood glucose much at all. Mushrooms are a good example. And then we also want to realize that when I give you a list, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are the only foods or the only good foods. We need to understand what do these have in common and realize that there are many other similar foods. So basically any real food that is similar is going to work really well. And then we also want to realize that even though these foods are selected to accommodate for the Warburg effect, to starve a cancer cell because it likes sugar, a lot of these foods, if they're real food, they're also going to satisfy these other criteria. They're going to reduce or be neutral to chronic inflammation, to carcinogens and chemicals, to oxidative stress, to immune system, to hormonal balance, and to gut health. And this is very, very different from an isolated chemical or an isolated vitamin that might account for one of these. It might fit into one category or improve one thing, like a medication, but it's not going to fit into multiple. It's not going to create a complete holistic picture the way that whole food will. And since inflammation is a driving factor for cancer, we want to eat foods that lower inflammation, or at the very least are neutral. So that would include all low-carb foods again, because if we eat high carb and we become insulin resistant, that is a driving factor for inflammation. But then there are other natural foods and compounds in garlic, in turmeric, in ginger that can actually have a natural anti-inflammatory effect. Another good thing is berries. They contain things like anthocyanins. And then we have things like fatty fish. Even they're high in omega-3, then they have a normalizing effect on inflammatory responses. So it's not like a pill that you take that's anti-inflammatory, but it helps the body modulate and balance out to appropriate inflammatory responses. Another example is broccoli. Contains something called sulforaphane, and in dark chocolate we have things like flavonoids. Extra virgin olive oil and olives have something called oleocanthal. And again, I've given you a few examples here, but realize that there are also many other real foods that will be beneficial and contain many similar things. And even though we're talking mostly about the inflammation component here, the chronic inflammation, a lot of these foods will actually help in all of these different categories. And then we have carcinogens and chemicals that the body has to detox. And who does that? Well, primarily the liver. So if the liver is overburdened from other things like sugar and alcohol, that's not so great. So we want to cut those out first. And then we want to think liver support. What is it that helps the liver? And I've done specific videos on that. But again, low carb, low sugar, because those things create a fatty liver that's a burden on the liver. We have cruciferous vegetables with something called glucosinolates. We have tomatoes with lycopene, and these are different compounds that assist the liver in its detoxification pathways. In the leek family, like garlic, we have sulfur compounds that also assist the liver. And then we have eggs that contain choline, which is a very important nutrient for the liver to perform some of its metabolic processes. And then I hope you're starting to see the pattern, and many other whole foods, many other real foods are going to be very similar to this. So if we start understanding and seeing patterns, then we're not limited to certain foods, and we stop thinking about them as magic pills or magic bullets. And again, we focus on carcinogen detox, detoxifying chemicals that can be harmful. But if they're whole foods, then they will probably assist us in many other ways also. And foods can be immune boosting. So garlic, ginger are very well known as immune boosters. They are antibacterial in themselves. So if you have an immune challenge, they can actually kill off some things on their own, like a natural antibiotic. But they can also help with immunomodulation, with balancing and stimulating and making the immune system behave right. And they can also boost the production of white blood cells, which are your immune fighting cells. Another example is mushrooms. They contain something called beta-glucans, and that can have an immune stimulating effect, stimulate immune function. And bell pepper contains vitamin C, which is also a necessary component for the immune system. And a lot of times people will talk about citrus fruit and especially orange juice, and they start gobbling up orange juice by the gallon as if that was the only thing that had vitamin C. Well, bell pepper actually has more vitamin C than citrus fruit, but it has a fraction of the sugar. So again, we don't want to just take something that could be good if it also contains something that's going to counteract that. And again, even though I'm mentioning certain compounds that are contained in these foods, there are also going to be many other whole real foods that contain these or similar compounds. And again, we're focusing on the immune portion, but if these foods are natural and whole and alive and fresh, then they're going to assist us on many different areas. Now, what about hormone balance? What does that have to do with it? Well, it's two hormones primarily that are associated with driving cancer, and that is estrogen and insulin. And with estrogen, of course, it's primarily females and breast cancer, but there are some other cancers as well. But the thing we need to know here is that insulin is the primary factor. So if we have high levels of insulin, if we're insulin resistant, that's the primary factor that's going to dysregulate, that's going to unbalance estrogen. So the very first thing we need to do is to make sure that our insulin levels are okay. So again, we want to eat a low carb or a moderate carb diet, especially if you're insulin resistant. So the more insulin resistant you are, the less carbs you want to eat. And broccoli shows up again. It has something called indole 3-carbinol that has been shown to help balance out estrogen levels. And what's important both for inflammation and hormone regulation is that we have a lot of healthy fats. So fatty fish that are high in omega-3s, and then extra virgin olive oil, avocado, that are high in monounsaturated fats that are very neutral to inflammation can be very helpful for the body to perform a lot of its functions. And now you're starting to catch on. You know that there are many other real foods that will be similar to these that can also help you in all these different areas. And then we want to choose foods to reduce oxidation and oxidative stress. So there are foods that contain natural antioxidants, and those are the ones that we want to make sure we get plenty of. But it doesn't mean that more antioxidants is always better, like some people think, and then they run to the store and they buy these mega dose synthetic antioxidants. That's not a good idea, because oxidation is what gives us energy. When we eat food and we turn it into energy, we oxidize that food. We produce oxygen and free radicals, and then we need these natural antioxidants to neutralize the free radicals. But it is totally possible to eat a bunch of these megadose synthetic antioxidants and interfere with energy production. And they've done long-term studies where they find that the people who eat the most synthetic antioxidants live the shortest. It actually takes years off your lifespan, because that's not the way we want to go about it. We want to get things that are natural, that help the body balance it out naturally, not mega doses that go in and interfere and flatten what the body is trying to do. And these natural antioxidants we can find in berries, in dark chocolate, green tea, turmeric, tomatoes, pomegranate are all very rich sources. And you're going to find some of these antioxidants in virtually every type of plant. So there's a wide variety of plants, as well as many other real foods that will help you get these benefits and that can assist you with all of these different risk factors and mechanisms for cancer. And then there is gut health that is tied to immune function. Your immune system is heavily dependent on what happens in the gut. Your inflammatory responses, your inflammatory regulation, your allergies, autoimmune responses depend on what's happening in the gut, how healthy and intact that is. And also your hormone balance, because a lot of stuff going on in the gut can affect your hormone signaling. So in other words, poor gut health leads to disease. So the foods for gut health is not always totally straightforward to figure out, because some of the things that you're supposed to take, some things that are supposed to be good for you, if you can't tolerate them, if you get gassy and upset stomach, etc., then that's a good sign, or a bad sign rather, that there is some imbalance and you probably do need some help. And if you like some more information on that, I'll put it down below. We are working up a program to help more people long distance, where we can do some of these tests and where we can coach you and guide you through that process. But one of the first things that you want to have is fermented foods, or probiotic foods. And these are foods that contain bacteria that are good for your gut, or supposed to be good for your gut. And some of them can colonize and set up shop and help balance things out, and others just kind of pass through. But in doing that, they outcompete some of the bad bacteria. They provide a competitive environment and keep some of the others down. And some foods here are examples like sauerkraut and kimchi and yogurt and kefir, and you could ferment lots and lots of different types of food. And then you have prebiotic foods. The first category is probiotic. That's the actual bacteria or spore. But the prebiotic, that's the stuff that feeds the probiotic. It acts as food for them. And here we have things like asparagus and onion, garlic and leek. They contain a lot of something called inulin, or FOS, fructooligosaccharides. And we also have leafy greens that contain certain types of fiber and also a lot of polyphenols. Also cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. They also have lots of good compounds. They have some fiber, but also some other compounds that can selectively feed and create a good variety in your gut. And if you haven't figured it out yet, in addition to these foods I mentioned, there are many other good real foods as well. So don't limit yourself to this. And even though these are a little special in some ways, they're not unique. They're not the only ones that you want to eat. But I started off saying that while it's important what you eat, it's even more important what you don't eat. So let's compare and contrast a little bit on these 7 different mechanisms that create cancer and see what processed food does for them. So first, we have high sugar and white flour. In processed foods, they're going to be primarily made from sugar and white flour. And of course, that's going to raise blood sugar. So immediately we are violating the principle of not feeding the cancer. But then we also need to understand that long-term intake of sugar and white flour is going to drive chronic inflammation. It's going to be the most common mechanism in driving insulin resistance and chronic inflammation. So now we immediately knock out the second principle of chronic inflammation. We violate that. But this processed food that's high in that stuff is also going to create a lot of oxidative stress. So again, a strike for oxidative stress here. And then these processed foods are also going to contain a lot of chemicals. They're going to have artificial sweeteners, artificial flavorings, artificial colors. You're going to have pesticides and stabilizers and preservatives, etc. And not only are some of these going to be carcinogenic, and maybe we don't find out for another few years, but a lot of things that are used in some countries are banned in other countries. But also, these chemicals will create oxidative stress and inflammation. So again, it doesn't just affect one thing. Something that's really bad can strike out lots and lots of different things. So now already we have 4 out of 7 things here with a strike. And then it works the other way. So all 4 of these things are going to work the other way and create an immune system compromise. There's going to be an additional burden on your immune system. So we get a big red X on immunity as well from processed foods. So how is processed foods for hormones? Well, we know that sugar and white flour is going to drive blood sugar and insulin resistance, and that insulin is going to dysregulate estrogen like we talked about. But also, a lot of these chemicals that they add to food are going to act as endocrine disruptors. And that means that they're going to unbalance your hormone system. A lot of these chemicals, the molecules are going to have a shape and size that's similar to a hormone, and it's going to fit into the same receptor and confuse the body. So it's going to block something and stimulate it, or it's going to fit into it and stop it. So you get too much or not enough of something because of this endocrine dysregulation. So processed food is pretty good at messing up your hormone system too. So what about gut health? What does processed food do for that? Well, once we understand how closely tied gut health is to all of these different factors, and we see now, I put some arrows that are mostly going both directions, meaning that these things, these mechanisms will cause dysbiosis, will cause an imbalance, will cause a pathogenic overgrowth, will dysregulate your biome, but then that unbalanced gut will further create more problems, will worsen all of these different things. So it's like a vicious cycle that just keeps going. Then I hope you start realizing that processed food is just not such a good idea, that 90% of what you eat should be something other than processed foods. When we mess with it, when we add chemicals, when we repackage it, then it just doesn't work like food anymore. And here's one example of such an item. It's very popular. I'm not going to call it out by name, but you've all heard of it. And if an ingredient list looks like this, then it's absolutely not something that you want to consume. But here's the scariest part, that we have all this food. We have a culture where there's thousands of products with ingredient lists like this, and then they try to help you understand this food by giving you something called nutrition facts. And the only thing that you get really to evaluate whether this is good or bad is how many calories does it have. And we've just gone through and shown that all 7 of the different mechanisms that cause cancer are heavily influenced by all these different factors and these different chemicals. And then we get a label where we try to understand this based on calories and a few different grams. This label does not tell the story. So learn to understand what real food is and eat almost exclusively real food. If you enjoyed this video, you're gonna love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.